The Chicago Cubs and White Sox are two of baseball's best-known teams in one of America's largest cities. And in this video, we're going to compare the two, see how they stack up against each other based on multiple factors. This is the Chicago Cubs versus the Chicago White Sox, similar and different. So the first factor we're going to look at here is history. Both the Cubs and White Sox franchises were among the original 8 teams of their respective leagues. The Cubs would begin in 1876 as one of the original National League teams. Then they were known as the Chicago White Stockings. The White Stockings would eventually become the Colts. The Colts would become known as the Orphans for a time. And then finally in 1903, they would become known as the Cubs. When the White Sox were established as one of the 8 original American League teams in 1901, they would go by White Stockings for their first 3 seasons, since the name was no longer being used by Chicago's National League franchise. However, they would change to their current name in 1904. They both would have a lot of success early on in their franchise histories, and would actually go head-to-head against each other in the 1906 World Series, which the White Sox won 4-2. The Cubs would appear in 3 of the next 4 World Series, winning 2 of them in 1907 and 1908. The 1917, 18, and 19 World Series would also feature at least one of these 2 teams as well. The White Sox World Series appearance in 1919 would be shrouded in controversy over the Black Sox scandal, where it is believed that several players were paid to lose the World Series on purpose. Both would then have 2 of the longest World Series win droughts in MLB history, the White Sox being 87 years and the Cubs being 107 years. This now moves us to the subject of success. The Cubs have been a slightly more successful team than the White Sox, with a .513 win percent to the White Sox .503 win percent. The Cubs have won the National League 17 times to the White Sox winning the American League 6 times. However, both have won the same amount of World Series at 3. And the Cubs have 14 Hall of Famers to the White Sox 13. So overall, the Cubs have had slightly more success than the White Sox, but in what most people would consider as the most important statistical category, World Series wins, they are tied. Next, we're going to compare stadiums. The Cubs would have a few short-term venues early on, but their only 2 longer-term homes and only 2 stadiums that they've played in when they were known as the Cubs have been Westside Stadium and Wrigley Field, which would go under multiple names before it was finally named Wrigley Field. The White Sox would play in Southside Stadium for their first 10 years, and then would play for 80 years at Comiskey Park, which it would stay under that name for most of its history until they moved to their current home of Guaranteed Rate Field. Both teams have spent a considerable amount of their histories playing in jewel box ballparks. The White Sox from 1910 to 1990 at Comiskey, and the Cubs from 1916 through today at Wrigley. Comparing their 2 current venues, Guaranteed Rate and Wrigley, by most accounts and surveys, Wrigley ranks as one of the top ballparks for its atmosphere, aesthetics, location, and history, while Guaranteed Rate rates usually as one of the worst, as it was built at the end of the modern era of ballparks where features were more generic, right before retro classic ballparks would become the norm and feature much better atmospheres. It's also been renovated many times to fix some of its poorly received features, such as its original high and steep upper deck. Wrigley Field has much more memorable and notable features, such as its ivy outfield wall, jewel box appearance, scoreboard, and Wrigley rooftops, while Guaranteed Rate really doesn't have anything quite like that. As far as where they're located, Wrigley is north of downtown in a neighborhood setting, while Guaranteed Rate is in what most people would consider to be a more dangerous area of Chicago, going towards the south side, and is sandwiched between a freeway and railroad tracks. Guaranteed Rate has much more on-site parking, as it's pretty much surrounded by a parking lot. However, at Guaranteed Rate, you won't see really anything outside of the stadium, while with Wrigley, you can see the surrounding neighborhood from inside the stadium. According to recent data, Wrigley Field is considered the most expensive place to watch a ball game, while Guaranteed Rate is quite a bit lower at number 11. So overall, Wrigley is pretty much superior to Guaranteed Rate in almost every way. It's in a better neighborhood, it has better views, it has more of a old school baseball feel to it, and it also has much more unique features to it. The only things Guaranteed Rate really has over it is more capacity, cheaper prices, and more on-site parking at the stadium. Next, we're going to go into the financials of the two teams. As of 2022, the Cubs are valued at $3.8 billion, which is good for fourth in Major League Baseball, while the White Sox are estimated to be worth $1.76 billion, which is good for 15th overall. So the Cubs are basically worth more than double what the White Sox are. The Cubs' revenue was $425 million, which was good for 5th in MLB, while the White Sox revenue at $258 million last year was good enough for 24th in baseball. The Cubs have more often than not since 2000 had the higher payroll of the two, the Cubs almost regularly being in the top 10 in baseball, while the White Sox are usually somewhere in the middle, but some years are very low and some years are very high. Which leads us to our final comparison factor, which is fans. Cubs fans regularly fill up Wrigley Field. They've averaged over 30,000 fans a game for the last 25 years, not including seasons that were influenced by COVID. The White Sox have only averaged 30,000 fans a game 3 times in the last 25 years. The Cubs appeal more so to the northern half of the city, while the White Sox appeal more so to the southern half. Based on multiple factors such as attendance, ticket prices, TV ratings, the Cubs definitely have a much larger fan base and likely a much more wealthy one as well, while the White Sox is kind of the more blue-collar of the two. With more pennants, a longer history, and a far superior ballpark, the Cubs definitely have a stronger hold over Chicago than the White Sox do. They had the World Series parade for the Cubs. It's estimated that 5 million showed up. When the White Sox had their parade, it was estimated that 1.75 million showed up. So in conclusion, these teams definitely have a lot that's different from each other, but they do have some similarities. They both have been around a very long time. They both played at similar style ballparks for a very large portion of their histories. They both had a lot of success early on in their history, and then they both had a very long World Series drought, followed by more recent World Series wins, while both winning the same amount of World Series titles. Major differences are the Cubs are definitely the much more supported team in Chicago than the White Sox. They make a lot more money, a lot more people attend their games, and the two have very different ballparks built during 2 very different times. And it appears that the Cubs will be the more popular team for the foreseeable future in Chicago. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, thank you for watching.